Gun violence in general and mass shootings in particular are notoriously commonplace here in the United States as compared to the rest of the world. In fact, there have been 2 mass shootings in the United States just since I last produced a video for this series. There was the Isla Vista shooting, and then just a few days ago there was another shooting in Seattle, Washington. Now, numbers can vary depending on what you're counting, depending on how you define a mass shooting. But generally speaking, the United States accounts for around 80% of the mass shootings that occur in the world. If you go to the website gunpolicy.org, you can find a really excellent statistical comparison tool that allows you to compare all sorts of gun-related data country to country. You can compare the United States to other comparable nations, to nations in the world that I think could be fairly described as our peers. Similar economic development, similar forms of government, that sort of thing. And if you do that, and you can compare rates of gun violence, not just raw numbers, which would differ higher or lower depending on the population of a given place. You can compare rates, so you can be sure that you're always getting an apples to apples comparison. And what I think you'll find is that in most categories, in terms of the rate of gun ownership, the rate of gun homicides, the rate of gun violence in general, gun-related deaths, whether they're homicide or accidental or suicide, whatever, the United States leaves the rest of the developed world in the dust in most of those categories. We may be falling behind in terms of quality of health care and education, but we are acing it when it comes to gun violence. But why is gun violence such a problem in the United States relative to other places? Well, I think part of it is to do with the nature of our gun laws, particularly our federal gun laws. They are incredibly weak. There are certain states which have very strong gun regulations, like Maryland, the state where I live, like California, other states. But then there are also states like Texas, like West Virginia, where there are very little gun laws and where it's incredibly easy for most people to just go get a gun. I think the laws have something to do with it. The fact that it's so easy to get a gun and there are so many guns to be had. But I think it's also a problem of culture. Now, I know a lot of people use the gun culture argument, and a lot of responsible gun owners use the gun culture argument, and they use it as a way, whether they intend to or not, it deflects the argument from discussion of gun laws. They say, well, laws won't do it, it's the culture. And I agree that the culture is a big part of it. I agree that one of the major reasons why gun control is such a controversial issue in the United States, and why gun violence is such a massive problem, and why mass shootings in particular are so commonplace, is because we are gun fetishists in the United States. The reason why it's so easy to get a gun, the reason why even troubled people who should not be let within miles of a firearm are able to pass background checks, are able to go and legally purchase firearms and then use them to inflict incredible destruction on people and on communities, is because we value our guns so incredibly highly, and we value our right to own guns so incredibly highly. But then the question becomes, if the proliferation of guns, if the ease with which one can acquire a gun is due, at least in large part, to the gun culture in the United States, then what's to be done about it? How do we change that culture? How do we break that spell that guns and gun ownership have over so many people? How do we convince people that their liberty is not tied directly to how many guns they own or how many guns they are legally allowed to own? How do we convince people that there are higher forms of liberty, there are higher ways of expressing and enjoying and taking advantage of your freedom than owning a gun? How do we do that? Well, one of the ways we can do that, I would argue, is by changing the gun laws. Laws can be a powerful influence and a powerful way of shaping a culture. Laws are not just rules governing behavior and deciding what people or government agencies can and can't do, or what their responsibilities are. They're also a way of setting priorities, of defining the limits of a society and a community, and defining, often in an indirect way, but nonetheless a way of what is important to us, how far we will go, how much we will tolerate, and at what point we will no longer tolerate something. I do have some specific suggestions as the gnats swarm around me here, and this is very important because often the pro-gun folks, or the folks who are very strongly opposed to any additional gun control, will accuse we gun control advocates, and quite rightly in many cases, of just being too vague. We say we need gun control, we need to do something, but we don't have any specific suggestions for what to do. And we should, because the case carries a lot more weight. It's a lot more persuasive if we can at least propose specific measures. So I agree with a lot of the measures that are usually proposed in the wake of gun violence events. I'm all for national registration, but there are some other ones that don't get as much press, that people don't talk about as much, which I think are just as important as registration and licensing, and making sure that people who own guns are fit to have them. A major problem to me is just the sheer number of guns. As I've said repeatedly in this video already, the sheer number of guns that we have in this country. And there are ways of reducing that number without the sorts of forced, widespread confiscations that many pro-gun people are afraid of. A buyback program. I would be hugely in favor of a federal buyback program, an ongoing, rolling, well-funded federal buyback program, where if you are a gun owner and you have guns that you no longer need or no longer want, you can sell them to the government as a part of this buyback program. You can get rid of the gun, we'll take the gun out of circulation, and you get some money in your pocket in exchange for the gun. I think that's a splendid idea. And in addition to that, and of course all the guns that are sold as a part of the buyback would be destroyed. They would not be sold back into the private market. The whole point of the program would be to reduce the number of guns in the population. And on a similar note to that, I would also love to see a federal law mandating that firearms seized from criminals by law enforcement, once they're no longer needed for judicial purposes, instead of just storing them in the weapons, in the evidence locker forever, or auctioning them back into the private market, as often happens, I would love to see a federal law mandating that those weapons be destroyed. So seized guns, confiscated guns from criminals, destroyed. Get rid of them. Get them out of circulation permanently. Those are two really, and again, I don't see how either of those measures threaten gun ownership. And I know that criminals will always be able to get guns. I know that no measure, nothing that I've just proposed, nothing that anybody has proposed would ever stop criminals from getting their hands on a gun. I'm sure it would always be possible for someone to be resourceful enough to get their hands on a gun. That's not the point. Shouldn't it be as difficult as possible? Shouldn't our interest as a society be to make it as difficult as possible for such irresponsible or poorly, maliciously intentioned people to get their hands on a lethal weapon? There's a bumper sticker I see a lot that reads, "What part of shall not be infringed don't you understand?" But of course, you can interpret the First Amendment according to that logic just as easily as you can the Second. And in fact, historically, the courts here in the United States have interpreted the First Amendment in such a way that allows for the right to free speech to be infringed in certain scenarios, under certain circumstances. For instance, it doesn't specifically allow in the Constitution for the government to infringe on someone's free speech if that speech constitutes slander, if that speech constitutes a violation of copyright. if that speech is found to be inciting to violence, let's say. None of that's in the Constitution. The Constitution says the right to freedom of speech shall not be infringed, similar to the freedom of religion, also in the First Amendment. It doesn't say specifically that the government has the power to limit the practice of religion if that practice of religion would involve cruelty to another person. It doesn't say that the freedom of religion is not to be infringed except in cases of potential animal cruelty or in cases of child endangerment. And yet we have seen many cases where the religious excuse for such practices doesn't work. You can't just do whatever you want and say, well, freedom of religion. It doesn't work that way. We interpret the First Amendment in such a way so that we can honor the spirit of it, and we can protect the exercise of that right in a sensible, reasonable way, but we can also pass statutes that prevent that freedom from being abused and prevent that freedom from being used to harm others, or to allow the practice of cruel or vicious or harmful, destructive things that could then be justified by citing that right. And if we do that with freedom of speech, with the First Amendment, with freedom of religion, why is it so unthinkable that we should do that with the Second Amendment?